behaviors that are categorized under one diagnosis or another. They don't realize that the commonality is the early childhood loss and trauma. And when you present them with that information, and you present it to them in detail, with all the research parameters being covered, so that it's not just impressionistic or anecdotal, but actually research-based, they sit there stunned. They don't know what to do with it. I'm told, like Dr. Bruce Perry, who's the head of the Houston Child Trauma Academy, leading research on childhood trauma and brain development, he tells me the same thing. And Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's the lead investigator of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies in California, showing again the exponential impact of childhood loss. The more losses accrue, the greater risk of addiction, greater risk of cancer, greater risk of autoimmune disease, mental illness, dysfunction, criminality, relationship problems, personality disorders, etc., etc., etc. He tells me the same thing. So when you address professional audience, particularly, who are intellectually trained, they sit there wrapped in their intellectual armor, and they literally are petrified by this material. And I've had that impression. Earlier this year, there was an article in Pediatrics, which is the leading pediatrics journal in North America. It's the official publication of the American Academy of Pediatrics. There was an article from Harvard Center on the Developing Child, February of this year, collating all the material, showing how early childhood stress or trauma results in adaptations that help the child survive in the short term, but are the basis of pathology, physical illness, mental illness later on. And I presented this information to a group of pediatricians in a major Canadian city, the grand rounds at a hospital. I said, look, in your own journal, here it is. I don't have to sweat anymore to prove this to you. I've been saying this for a long time. But here it is. They sat there in stunned silence. It's not that they argued with me. Had they argued and engaged, pointed out where the data was flawed or whether the logic was somehow inadequate, that would have been fine. No, they just didn't know what to do with it. But the denial comes first. So what I'm saying is that there's an emotional block. It's not an intellectual block. We don't need a stitch more research on what causes addiction. We don't need one more bit of research on what causes violence, rape, psychopathic behavior, mental illness. We don't need a stitch more research. I know that sounds like a radical statement in a society which is so research-oriented and where whole industries, intellectual industries, knowledge factories are based on having to gather more money for research to justify more jobs, to justify more papers. But I'm telling you, if we simply applied what we already know, if we simply drew the lessons of what's already been clearly shown, we would have a totally different world. They showed that childhood trauma may be a predisposing factor in addictions. More study is required. And I'm thinking, what planet are these people living on? Are they not familiar with the hundreds of studies that have shown a relationship between trauma and addiction? Do they not know the adverse childhood experiences studies? Are they not aware of the data on brain development and trauma? And what intellectual labyrinth have they been lost in for the last 50 years for them to come up with this study that says childhood trauma may be related to addictions? Maybe. And then more studies required. So what I'm saying is that the very need for research and intellectualization is actually a factor of denial. It represents denial. And that denial really is really about people's own emotional pain. So the block is that this stuff is painful. And therefore we dare not look at it in ourselves. And therefore we don't open to its existence in others. And then we have to look for all kinds of other reasons. If you deny pain owing to early experience and early loss and early trauma, then the world becomes very complicated and justify all kinds of complicated explanations. Yet if we see that a child has certain needs, and if you meet those needs, that child will be just fine. And if you don't, he'll have to adapt somehow. And those adaptations are the basis of dysfunction later on. That's really simple. They call it simplistic. It's not simplistic, it's simple. The world is really very simple. We make it complicated because of our denial. There's only one simple thing I've ever said in any of my books. You treat children well, they'll turn out okay. You don't treat them well, they don't turn out okay. Or at least they may not turn out so okay, and in fact they may have severely dysfunctional in their lives. That's it. That's all there's to it. All science comes down, all human science, psychology, behavioral science, psychiatry, educational philosophy, that's what it comes down to. It's not just a factor of emotional denial, of course. It also serves a social need. Because if you're going to construct or live in a society or invested in a society that fundamentally objectifies people, and people become either producers or commodity consumers, then you have to actually ignore their fundamental emotional and spiritual needs. Because if people had fundamental emotional and spiritual needs, you would not treat them the way this society treats people. You know, you would not make them work for low wages at a Walmart. You would not sell them products they don't need, let alone don't need, actually makes them sick. There's a deep need to belong, a deep need to be loyal, and a sense of betrayal when that loyalty is somehow insulted. If you didn't get the love that you needed, you'll be consumed by being liked, and then you'll be very likable and very nice. And you might become a helpful, very helping individual. Which is a coping pattern. Now, you can be genuinely nice and genuinely supportive of others and still look after your own needs. That's human nature, I think. But a lot of people are very nice and likable and helpful by suppressing their own needs. That's a coping mechanism. Everybody says how nice they are. And when they die at age 50 of cancer, everybody shows up at their funeral and they weep about how nice they were, how selfless they were. You know, I saw the biography, the Martin Scorsese biography of George Harrison the other night. And Harrison was one of these people. Ringo Starr was visiting Harrison a couple of weeks before Harrison's death in Switzerland of brain tumor from lung cancer that had spread to his brain. Starr's own daughter had a brain tumor and was in Boston for an operation, and Starr was having to leave Switzerland visiting his dying friend and go to be with his daughter. And Harrison, who can barely get out of bed at this point, says, "Shall I come with you?" And Ringo Starr, when he says this, he starts weeping at how nice and how helpful and compassionate Harrison was, which he was, but at whose expense? And these are the people that end up with cancer. Now that's a coping mechanism. It meant that your childhood was such where your needs weren't met and you had to pay more attention to the needs of the parents. And that's how you cope. That's how you maintain the relationship with them. The day I read Harrison's biography some years ago, the day he got married, he reassured his mother that, "Mom, don't worry, I'll still be visiting you." Like apologizing really for getting married. Now that tells me everything about what happened in their childhood, his childhood. And of course he was known as the quiet Beatle, who didn't assert himself, who didn't speak out. And on their early albums, he was a great songwriter, but you wouldn't know that from their early albums because Lennon and McCartney were more dominant and he was the quiet one. So that self-suppression, that quietness, is actually a coping mechanism. The child basically has two needs. We have the need for attachment, which is the seeking of closeness and proximity with another human being, and fundamentally, the attachment dynamic is the most powerful dynamic in human life. And its basic purpose is the protection and nurturing of the young. So that infants attach to their parents and parents attach to infants for the purpose of, on the one hand, of being taken care of, and on the other, of taken care of. So that's attachment. And we're wired for attachment all our lives. It's the most important dynamic we have. And as Gentleman Petraeus could tell you, that we're wired for attachment, and sometimes when our attachment needs get sent in certain directions, it'll trump everything else. That's one need that we have, is for attachment. Without attachment, there's no human life. It's just impossible. And without mating, without communities, we would not have survived as a species either. As rugged individualists, we would not have got off the first evolutionary base, let alone, come to where we are right now. So it's, the whole idea of human beings as competitive and aggressive is total nonsense. But the other need that we have is for authenticity, to be ourselves. And that again has to do with survival. If you're not in touch with yourself out in the wild, you don't survive. So authenticity is being in touch with yourself and being able to act on your awareness of self in relationship to the environment. I mean, that's just authenticity. So if I feel something, I pay attention to that. If I don't, I'm in danger. So we have this need for authenticity. But if a child is confronted with a dilemma, that if I'm authentic, express my feelings, then my attachments are threatened because my parents can't handle it, because they're too stressed, depressed, or traumatized themselves, then perforce the child will not automatically, will automatically but not consciously suppress their authenticity. And so that the suppression of gut feelings and authenticity is a coping mechanism. That means I'm no longer in touch with my needs. I no longer pay attention to my feelings, my emotions. I will no longer be aware of them. I won't express them. I won't know what I need, which has all kinds of implications. But one of them is that I may then compulsively serve the needs of others, ignoring my own, hence disease. Or I may then develop all kinds of false needs, which then really are what addictions are all about. Now, so that it's that irresolvable tension between authenticity and attachment that many children in our society are faced with, that results in their self-suppression. The Western medical model, and I don't mean the science of it, I mean the practice of it, because the science is completely at odds with the practice. The practice of it makes two devastating separations. First of all, we separate the mind from the body. We separate the emotions from the physiology. So we don't see how the physiology of people reflects their lifelong emotional experience. So we separate the mind from the body, which is not something that traditional medicine has done. I mean, Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine or shamanic tribal cultures, medicinal practices throughout the world have always recognized that mind and body are inseparable. They intuitively knew it. Many Western practitioners have known this, have even taught it, but in practice we ignore it. And then we separate the individual from the environment. So the studies are clear, for example, that when people are emotionally isolated, they tend to get sick more quickly and they succumb more rapidly to their disease. Why? Because people's physiology is completely related to their psychological social environment. And when people are isolated and alone, their stress levels are much higher because there's nothing there to help them modulate their stress. And physiologically, it's straightforward. It takes a 5-year-old kid to understand it.